Hello, I'm Bill McNally. Welcome to America's Future. My guest today is Dr. Samuel Blumenfeld. He is an author, educator. He has written for the New American Magazine, WorldNet Daily, Reason Magazine. He is the author of several books. I have a few here. One, The Whole Language Outcome-Based Education Fraud, and several others. Welcome to Windham, New Hampshire again, Dr. Blumenfeld.
Well, nice to be with you, Bill.
Great. You know, now that the Democrats have won control of both houses of Congress, how is this going to impact public education?
Well, of course, you know, the Democrats are very much interested in education from a point of view of teacher unions. The NEA, for example, the National Education Association, is probably the single largest group of individuals who are at the Democratic National Convention. They vote, and they are ecstatic by having been able to reverse what is happening in Congress with the Republicans. And of course, President Bush, though, has been very good about the Department of Education, and of course he and Senator Kennedy co-authored the No Child Left Behind law, which of course really should be every child left behind. That's what it does, because it really does not solve the problem of public education. And I doubt that the Democrats will be able to solve it. So the Democrats are there, and they will be pushing the NEA's agenda, which of course, you know, is multiculturalism, gay marriage, abortion on demand, all of those things that the NEA has stood for many years. They're way over on the far left.
I notice one of your books here too is NEA, Trojan Horse in American Education.
Yes. Well, I did a study of the National Education Association, and I came to the conclusion that it really, the union itself is so politicized that it should be considered a political party. But of course, they're part of the Democratic Party, the Democrats, and they put all of their hopes on getting Democrats into Congress and the Senate. And of course, they won this time, so they're very happy. They were very unhappy when the Republicans took control of Congress.
So this was a big win then for the...
Oh, yes, a big win for the National Education Association.
Okay. So then how will this affect the general outcome of the public school curriculum?
Well, we will have more of the same. We will have sex education, multiculturalism, all of those liberal programs, you know, whole language, the new math, the downgrading of academics in favor of socialization. You're going to have the kind of programs that denigrate individualism and encourage groupthink, group activities, and socialization. That's what the original Dewey program was. It was to it was to downgrade the teaching of reading, writing, and arithmetic, downgrading the academics in favor of socialization. And if you go to any public school today, you will see that that's what's going on. The kids are seated around little tables, they're socializing with one another, they're pestering one another, and they're coughing into each other's faces, you see, which didn't happen when you sat in rows. In the old-fashioned school, where the desks were arranged in rows and they were bolted to the floor, and if you coughed in the back of somebody's head. But now you cough directly into your fellow student's face. And that's why we have a higher number of illnesses coming out of the new configuration of schools. And so everything is configured to encourage groupthink, group socialization, and no individualism. That is, they want to get away from the individual who can read well and has individual intelligence.
You know, I was going to ask you here about the reading problem, but before that, there's an interesting quote in here that took place somewhere around 1985, and it had to do with a National Commission on Education, and it basically said, quoting from your book, I think I can paraphrase it, that if a foreign power had imposed the mediocre education that exists in the American schools today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. End of quote.
Yeah.
So, what about the reading problem? Do you see any improvement there?
Well, first let me address what you have just said about the that it would be like an act of war, what we were doing to ourselves. If somebody else had tried to do it to us, we'd consider it an act of war. Well, that was from the Nation at Risk report.
Okay, yeah.
That was put out by this commission that had been put together to study the problems of public education. And as you can see, they came to the conclusion that things were so bad that it was as if an enemy had taken control of our schools, you see. Now, you might ask, has anything changed since then? I'm afraid not. I mean, that commission's report came and went, and the results have been, horrible. You still have the so-called reading war going on between whole language and intensive phonics, and I wrote a book on the subject, which you held up. So, yes, the reading problem. Do we still have a reading problem? Absolutely. And that's why one of the horrible things that our education system is doing is producing thousands, millions of young men who are unfit to really do anything constructive. For example, take today's black males. So few of them are willing to become fathers that now the percentage of black teenagers having children out of wedlock is something like 60 or 70%. And that's because these poor girls can't find a decent man to marry. And these men who are, will sire these kids are not interested in creating families. And so this is having a devastating impact. And one of the reasons for that is because so many of these men come out of the schools unable to read, you see. So their economic possibilities are very limited. If you can't read, there aren't very many good jobs that you can get, you see. So our education system is doing such a terrible thing to the American male, to the young American male, that is having a devastating effect on our country. And of course, what is interesting is that, you have Charlie Rangel saying that, well, the only people who are attracted to the military are those who can't get good jobs, But of course, that's not true. It's interesting that the military really has a more highly educated group of people than those that come out of the public schools and don't go into the military. They get into drugs, they get into this hip-hop music, and totally irresponsible. That's the problem. We're producing irresponsible young men because they can't read, they can't get jobs, and they have such low self-esteem that it's going to have a devastating effect on our social life.
Well, then what's the big problem here in teaching someone to read?
The big problem, of course, is the way they teach reading. They use a whole word method. That is, they teach children to look at our words as if they were Chinese symbols, to look at them as whole configurations. They do not teach intensive systematic phonics so that the child can see the phonetic structure of the word. You see, ours is an alphabetic system, and an alphabet, by definition, is a set of symbols, we call them letters, that stand for the sounds of the language. And once you learn the sounds that the letters stand for and can put them together into words, you can become a good phonetic reader. And once you're a good phonetic reader, then you can read anything. And but if you teach a child to read by the whole language method, the child has to memorize the words. And of course, there are just so many words that you can memorize, because our writing system is not meant to be memorized like that. They're not like Chinese symbols. You know, a young Chinese person has to memorize thousands of those symbols before they can read a newspaper. All we have to do is memorize the sounds of 26 letters, you know. Much easier to do, and yet our schools insist on using the method that does not produce good readers. And this battle has been going on since John Dewey recommended getting rid of intensive phonics and substituting this whole word method of teaching reading. And the only way that parents can guard themselves against that sort of thing is to go to the school where their children are being sent, and to ask the teacher, do you teach a sight vocabulary? Virtually all of them will say yes. But that's the key. The sight vocabulary is the thalidomide of primary education. I'm sure you're familiar with what thalidomide, that drug, did. It was given to pregnant women, and their children came out without arms, with stunted legs, with all kinds of problems. And that's what exactly that the whole language does, and the sight vocabulary does. It stunts brain growth. It stunts the growth of the intellect. And so all of these kids are coming out of the schools handicapped and stunted by the method that they were taught to read.
It's interesting. I have this book here because you've mentioned it in a couple of your books, Why Johnny Still Can't Read, A New Look at the Scandals of Our Schools. Apparently he wrote a book prior to this, Why Johnny Can't Read.
Yes, that's the famous book that you might say was the first skirmish in the reading war. He wrote a book, Why Johnny Can't Read, in 1955. That's 50 years ago that we knew what the problem was. And Flesch pointed it out very, very graphically. He said that doing away with phonics is the cause of our literacy problem. We had a reading problem in 1955, and we've got it in 2006. And it's caused by the same methodology. And the reason why we have not been able to change things in the schools is because the way the educators are organized in a national way and how they're being taught in the colleges of education. You see, the colleges of education teach the young teachers that the whole word look-say method is the way to teach, you see. And so that's why these young teachers come out of the teachers' colleges without having learned intensive phonics. They could not teach intensive phonics if they wanted to, because nobody has taught them how to do it. Now, I do it in my book, Alpha Phonics, you see. And I wrote this book specifically for parents who wanted to teach their children to read at home before they get to school. And so I wrote it in a way that any parent can use it very nicely. It's, as you say, user-friendly, particularly for parents who have not had a college education, or thank God they haven't gone to a teacher's college, because otherwise they wouldn't know how to do it. But all they have to do is read the instructions in this book, and they can teach their child to become a good phonetic reader at home.
How about this?
Well, this is a kit that was developed on the basis of Alpha Phonics. It has audio tapes for parents who never heard the sounds. You know, there are a lot of parents in this country who were never taught intensive phonics. So it has the audio tapes, in which every lesson is on tape, so that if the parent can't read the instructions, they can hear the instructions.
Then you've got flashcards too.
And then we have flashcards. We have a video that teaches them how to use the system. We've got the the teaching book that the parent uses with the youngster.
Okay.
And as you can see, Bill, there are no pictures because pictures are a distraction. They don't teach you how to read. And if you teach a child to read with lots of pictures, they won't read a book without pictures. And most of our books don't have pictures, you see. But if you teach a child to read without pictures, they will pick up any book, even whether or not it has pictures, and they'll enjoy reading it. And the instructions are in the little booklet. This is for the student, this is for the teacher or the tutor, you see. And then we also have a little flip book where the kids can actually make up their own little words, you see. You see, if they're sitting in the back of the car and doing nothing, they can make up their own little words and have fun doing it. And then also we have 11 little readers, you see. And these readers follow the lessons in the book so that after you've completed lesson 14, you can read your first little reader. And so this is a little book that only has short A words in it, short A words and consonants, no pictures, of course. And by the time the kids are done, by the time they reach book 10, this is what they're reading. You see quite a difference. They've learned to read.
Do you have a phone number where someone can get more information on that?
Yes, they can use my number, which is 781 899 6468.
6468.
Right.
Okay.
Now the Alphaphonics kit is $100, but the book alone is $25. So if the parents can't afford the kit, I'm sure they can afford the book itself, which is $25, and all of the instructions are in the back, so that the parent can see exactly how to teach every single lesson.
And you said the video would tell them how to
how to use the kit, how to use all of the items in the kit, right.
Okay.
See, and of course we have the flashcards and little rings that we put around them so that they won't get lost or misplaced.
Right.
And the purpose of flashcards is simply to increase the speed of word recognition. That's what it's for, you see. So we've done I did what had to be done because the schools were not doing it. Parents were concerned. And while there are other phonics programs on the market, the chief benefit of this one is that it does not have pictures. That's what makes this very different. And it also teaches spelling. You know, I get a lot of questions from parents who say, well, my child can read, but he can't spell. Well, the reason is that they're not taught to read in a way in which they can learn to spell. See, I teach spelling in the families. And we teach the letter sounds in their spelling families. And if you teach the spelling families, they will learn to read, you see, and they will learn to spell. For example, here when we teach the long E, the double E, we have all of those words that are spelled with the double E, you see. And of course, then we have EA, you see. So now they see words that are spelled with EA and not double E. So they have to know these things before they learn to spell. And what I tell parents whose kids can read well but can't spell, I simply tell them to have their child copy out of a book, correctly spelled books. It could be a book that the child is interested in, or an article from the encyclopedia, to simply copy it. And in the process of copying, they will learn how to spell those words correctly.
Is the whole word, or is that what led you to write The Victims of Dick and Jane and Other Essays?
Yeah, Dick and Jane is the method that most people, most young adults, most parents today were taught to read by the Dick and Jane method in the 1950s and 60s. And as a result, they themselves were victimized by that teaching method because most of them have very poor reading skills. I'll give you an example. The other day I was visiting my niece's son, who is in his late 20s, has a wife and a child, and I was discussing the reading problem with him. And he told me that he does not enjoy reading for pleasure. And that was a dead giveaway that he had been taught by the Look-Say method, by the Dick and Jane method, because one of the symptoms of anyone who has been taught to read that way is that they do not enjoy reading for pleasure, because reading is not pleasurable. Reading becomes a very, very difficult chore. And so the only kind of books that they read are those that have something to do with the way they're earning a living, you see. And so there are an awful lot of victims of Dick and Jane in our society who really don't realize how they've been victimized.
Well, President Bush has, what, 2 years to go? Can he still control the Department of Education in those 2 years?
I really doubt it, and I doubt that he even wants to control the Department of Education. You know, it was President Reagan who said that we ought to get rid of that Department of Education, but of course he was constantly being hampered in doing so by fellow Republicans, you see. And unfortunately, there are a lot of Republicans who believe in a Department of Education, who believe that public schools can be reformed and go along with the establishment. And so while President Bush has tried to do something, he's running into great trouble. For example, one of the measures that was passed in his administration was this bill on reading. They were going to dispense billions of dollars to schools who would use phonics in teaching reading. And what has happened is that the other side, those who teach the whole word method, the whole language method, complain. They said, this is discriminatory. Why should federal dollars go only to teaching of phonics? Why doesn't it also go for whole language? And so they've created a huge ruckus. And the phonics people are now in retreat, you see, because they can't say that they haven't been discriminating against the whole language thing. But it simply proves that the government, because it has to be neutral, you know, between good and bad, it has to accept the good and the bad, that the federal government is really is hampered from doing the right thing. And so we don't know what the outcome will be, but I imagine that that whole program will be dismantled, and the whole word, whole language people will shout in glee over their great victory over intensive phonics. So that's what we're dealing with, and that's why I tell parents, the only way you can make sure that your child learns to read is to teach them at home, homeschool them, or put them in a private school where you know they are teaching reading in the correct manner. And if the parent wants to find out how their child is being taught to read, to go to the school and talk to the teacher and ask the teacher, do you teach a sight vocabulary? And if the teacher says yes, then you know your child is going to wind up handicapped.
Now, you were educated in the 30s and the 40s. How's the education then as compared to today?
Well, back in those days, in the 30s and 40s in New York City, where I was born and brought up, and I went to the public schools, and in those days they used the traditional methods of teaching reading by phonics and the traditional method of teaching arithmetic. Bill, in those days it was called arithmetic, not math, because arithmetic is really a self-contained system, a counting system, while math deals with relationships. Math is much broader and deals with relationships. But you first have to know our counting system. You have to know arithmetic. You have to know the arithmetic facts. And the only way that you can learn them is through rote repetition, rote learning. That's the way you learn arithmetic. And of course, in today's public schools, Rote learning is a dirty word. They don't use rote learning. So they teach number concepts, you see. And so that's why the kids come out of the schools unable to really add up a column of figures.
Then they should learn those multiplication tables, correct?
Yes, absolutely. And the only way you can learn them is by rote memorization.
Right. Or else you've got to go through the slow method of adding.
Yeah, in other words, you count by ones. And that's what the kids do. They count by ones. I remember Peter Jennings, the late broadcaster, was visiting a school. He wanted a, quote, progressive school, and he wanted to see how the new methods were working. And there was this little girl doing a math problem, and she was counting on her fingers. Well, in other words, she didn't memorize the additions or the subtractions or the multiplication. She had to count on her fingers. That's going back to before we even had our great arithmetic system, which has to be memorized. And he thought that was wonderful. Oh, how progressive. She's using her fingers, you see.
Well, do you believe that homeschooling then can solve our education problems?
Well, I'm a very strong advocate of homeschooling, Bill, because the homeschooling families are really going to be of a measurable help to us in overcoming what is being done to so many children in the public schools. First of all, the homeschoolers are very literate. They learn to read well. Many of them use alphaphonics, have used my methods. They become superb readers. They're very moral because the homeschool movement in general is very close to religion. I'd say that 85% of homeschoolers in America are Christians and who adhere to their faith, and therefore the kids are very moral. They don't believe in dating. They believe in courtship, and they believe in large families. It's not unusual for a homeschool family to have 10 kids, you see. So from a demographic point of view, they are out birthing the liberals who tend to have, you know, maybe 1 or 2 kids. They'll have a designer kid, you know. And also, they were aborting. The liberals are the ones who were getting all the abortions, you see. So they're killing their kids off. They're killing off their future. And they're having fewer and fewer kids, so that the only people who are really having large families who believe in marriage, who believe in stability, who believe in religious principles, basically the homeschoolers. That's not to say that there aren't parents who put their kids in public schools who adhere to religion, but because their kids are in the public schools, their kids are at risk in 4 very serious ways. Their kids are at risk academically because of the methods of teaching, which produce learning disabilities, dyslexia, that sort of thing. Then they are at risk morally because of the teaching of sex education and drug education, all of these things that encourage kids to experiment. Then they are at risk spiritually because of how Christianity has been downgraded in the public schools, which are very secular and even atheistic. And then, of course, there is the physical risk, putting kids on buses in the middle of the night, you know, when it's still dark out in winter. And there have been many bus accidents all over the country. And not only the danger of buses, but also the danger of guns in the schools. We're supposed to have laws against guns, and yet kids manage to get them and bring them to school and shoot the place up, you see. So that's why homeschooling is so wonderful, is because the kids are not at risk at in a homeschool.
So are you saying that, or I should say, why can't the public schools then just be reformed to be like they were when you were in school?
Well, that's a wonderful idea. In other words, we know how to do it right. It's not as if we're looking for a cure for cancer. But you cannot go back because the powers that be will not permit it. Those who run the education system from top to bottom are wedded to their liberal agenda, their secular liberal agenda, and they have no intention of ever going back to the methods that were used that produced the greatest generation. You know, Tom Brokaw wrote a book about the greatest generation. Who were they? My generation. And we were all brought up in the traditional manner. We would educated in the traditional way, and so we produced the generation that fought and won World War II, that fought in the Korean War. Also, we were the generation that created this high-tech economy that we enjoy. And we're not getting those kinds of people anymore. We're not getting engineers. We're not getting the scientists. We're not getting mathematicians out of our schools. And Bill, since you are an engineer, you know what's happening, and you know how important it is for this country to produce good engineers and good mathematicians and good scientists. But most of the kids coming out of our public schools can't do any of that stuff.
So are you saying that the dumbing down process will continue?
Absolutely. The dumbing down process will continue, and that's one of the great tragedies of our country, is that we have this dumbing down process going on and continues to go on, so that most of our young people never grow up. They never become adults. They remain, you might say, held as adolescents for their entire lives. They cannot get beyond that because, first of all, they don't have the equipment, they don't have the reading skills so that they can learn enough to become responsible adults.
Well, then what's the purpose then of the present curriculum?
Well, the purpose of the present curriculum is to create willing workers for today's businesses. And unfortunately, these willing workers do not have the skills that they should have. And that's why we've got all this outsourcing. That's why now we're becoming more dependent on well-educated Indians from India to handle our computerized economy. And so more and more of our high-tech firms are going overseas and trying to recruit Chinese and Indians who are far better educated than Americans. And that's a pity, because we're spending all of this money on education in the United States, and it is not giving us what our economy needs. Well-educated individuals who can handle these highly technological jobs.
So what do you see, what is the future then of the homeschool movement?
Well, the future of the movement is that it's going to continue to grow, because more and more parents in America are going to conclude that if they want their child, if they want to guarantee that their child will become literate, highly educated, and motivated, and with that individual intelligence, that they're going to have to do it at home. And homeschooling has grown to the extent where almost every family knows, if they're not homeschooling, they know others who are homeschooling. And that's why I tell homeschoolers to proselytize their friends and their relatives to get into homeschooling, because that's really going to be the salvation of this country as far as education is concerned.
So what is it going to take then to restore American public education to the excellent system that it once was?
What is it going to take? It's going to take, first of all, knowledge on the part of our politicians who understand what is going on. And I'm afraid there are not very many who understand what has been done in public education and what has to be done. And also that knowledge has to become well known among the CEOs, the people who run businesses in America. You'd be surprised how few people actually understand what is going on in education today. They talk about reform in terms of, well, more money, more teacher training, but the teachers are only going to get the same kind of training, smaller class size. You know the litany, smaller class size, more money, more professional teachers, more textbooks, the wrong textbooks, more wrong textbooks, newer schools. I visited a brand new school in Waltham where I live, And you go in there, and they've got everything. They've got computers, TV monitors, wall-to-wall carpeting, elevators. They've got all the latest, but also they've got all this rotten curriculum. And they've got special ed classes. They had one class for kids who were very difficult to handle. There were 2 kids in the class, but they have a whole class, 2 kids, 1 teacher. Then they have a whole clinic in the school too, 3 beds with curtains around them, like a little hospital. And the impression you get after having gone through that school is that they believe that American children are basically sick, that they are basically uneducable and need the services of a hospital in the school. And also they have a cafeteria and a kitchen where they cook up the food for the kids. So it's a self-contained little universe, you see. And so the kids are being miseducated. And because they're being miseducated, you have to have all this remedial stuff going on. And of course, remedial teachers get paid much more than your ordinary teacher. So that encourages the creation of more kids with learning problems. And of course, the teaching methods being used create learning problems. So you have more learning problems, which require more highly paid teachers, and that's why the school budgets keep going up, even though they don't have many more kids to actually teach.
All right, well, I'm going to wrap it up here with this last question and ask you once again, or maybe just to reiterate, can parents really teach their children to read at home?
You know, that's an interesting question because so many parents consider themselves incompetent. But the truth is that, for example, I was talking to one mother who said, "Oh no, I can't teach my children. I just don't know enough." Well, I told her to give it a try, and lo and behold, she found out that she could do it even better than the schools. I mean, for parents to gain confidence in their ability to teach, all they have to do is read the instructions in this book, and they become an excellent teacher. That's all it takes, you know. And so I believe that more and more parents, once they're exposed to homeschooling, will realize that they can do the job. Now, I know that there are many parents who have to work, who can't do it themselves, but parents who would like to homeschool and can't do it, I would advise them to get to know a homeschooling family who would be willing to homeschool their kids as well, you see, and maybe pay a little, money to cover costs, whatever costs there are. And so there are ways to get around, the time element that is having to work. But I think that every child who is homeschooled at least